There, we're rolling. That's it. We can just get it going. Don't worry, I'm not going to get you to do any awkward intros because I'm just, again, I just want to say from the very start, I'm hugely grateful for you to giving up your time. And also, this has been arranged relatively quick because you got a big project this week. Do you mind if I ask what that
Oh,
is?
I am, well, my full-time job is a filmmaker. So if anyone's wondering why my content is the way it is in terms of quality, it's because that's my full-time job. I work as a filmmaker, but I also sort of dabble in sort of branding, creative strategy, design, animation, and we're doing a rebrand for a large AI lab, which I won't name because it's still a bit top secret. But
Oh, amazing.
obviously, AI is an extremely saturated
Okay.
market, and the brand, the positioning we want to go for is like putting people at the heart of AI. So AI that isn't designed by a small number of American and often Chinese men, but AI designed by the people for the people. That isn't necessarily about profit, but about the good of humankind. So that's pretty rewarding. I mean, I'm extremely blessed to be able to sort of work with such clients, and I just do a lot of work in artificial intelligence and technology innovation, and just I
Oh,
guess that
amazing.
segues really nicely into what my content is, where I work. I basically have to sit down with really smart people, professors, academics, researchers, MPs, often even like ministers, and I have to translate their ideas into something that is understandable to people like you and I in a way that's engaging and shareable and not some sort of vanity project. So that those are all lessons I've brought straight into the Tin Men in terms of how do I communicate these ideas in a way that is accessible. And that I didn't start that didn't start with the Tin Men. That started about 10 years prior to the Tin Men, where I've been sort of building a career in the creative
Mm.
industry on by doing those very things.
Because we're on the precipice of a big shift with AI, and I think that's met with a lot of fear. I think there's
Mm.
fear with any kind of change, but the concern about it dehumanizing the
Yeah.
human
So I
condition.
mean, yeah, the work we're doing is sort of AI for good. So one of the projects we're looking at is a type of AI that is able to you can take a photo of a knife that the police confiscate, and straight away the AI can tell you what knife it is, what other crimes it's linked to, how it was imported, how it's been distributed, and that all happens instantaneously. Because currently the way the police, the Met do it, they find a knife, and if no crime is attached to that knife, they don't look into it whatsoever. They just haven't got the time. So with AI, you're not replacing that police officer. You're enabling that police officer to do what that police officer's good at, which is being on the street, rather than sifting through knives all day. The similar deal we're doing in terms of
Mm.
working with NHS and AI that is able to scan people's retinas to understand diabetes, because obviously diabetes starts here and in your feet. So instead of having technicians spending hours and hours and hours going through a huge pile of about 50,000 different retinal scans to see who has diabetes and who hasn't, AI can do that like this, and quite literally that fast. So what a client will go into the NHS, and instead of asking technicians to spend 6 or 7 weeks going through all these scans, he'll just plug in a computer, and the computer will just do it instantly. And that's the sort of thing that will save huge amounts of money.
Mm.
And it frustrates me how no one talks about that in the context of funding for NHS. It seems to be people think the solution is just pouring more money into it rather than making the money we have go further. So that his project alone can save tens of millions of pounds for the NHS every single year, because obviously diabetes is a massive problem. So it's all good.
Sure. Yeah, definitely contributing to the greater good and just facilitating as a working dynamic what people are already doing. And as you say, it's not
Mm,
a case of always pouring money in, is it? It's streamlining what's already there because often the best people are already there. It's just
mm.
making their lives a little bit easier. By the sounds of it, all of these things you're doing are going to be amazing and put
I
in
hope so.
place
Yeah. Well,
eventually,
a
hopefully.
bit of help and a little bit of luck. We'll see.
Yeah. And your film, is that a little personal project, or is this a
I know.
filmmaker full
I'm a
time
filmmaker for
audience?
myself, so I run a production company, and we create these films, animations, documentaries, commercial. It's not a pitch, it's not a plug, and we just
No,
work.
make
Well,
it a plug.
I
I'm
mean, I'm
fascinated to
only
hear all
telling you
about
about it like in principle, but yeah, we just help translate very complicated ideas through film into something that you and I can understand in a way that's sort of short form and sort of magnetic. And yeah, that's my company, and the thing is, when you're working with clients, because I work quite quick, I'm good at doing things immediately. Like you talking about this podcast, inviting me on. Like if I can do a job in 10 minutes, if I can respond or something in 10 minutes, I'll do it, and then it's done. So that works really well for me, but it also means I have a lot of time because I'm just firing at emails, and there's a lot of time which some of my clients perhaps aren't quite as fast as me, and there'll be a week in which there was a week in which I'm waiting for them to respond. So because I don't know, I don't like to stand still. I want to create my own content. I use that time to create content for the Tin Men. So the downtime is where I create my content, and I enjoy it because it gives me a lot more creative autonomy to do whatever I want, to create the content as I like it rather than as my clients like it. And I think that's very freeing and something I find very rewarding. Aside from the obvious, that the Tin Men has been for a lot of people a very useful source of content that makes people feel seen, and that's obviously very rewarding too.
Yeah, because that's part of the conundrum, I think. And often the message, especially what we'll get onto, is the topic of male mental health is this, which is part of
Mm,
the conundrum, speaking, but I don't really think the issue is one of speaking. It's often this being
mm,
seen, heard, understood, but meeting where they're at because it's distinctly different, I think, than male plight sometimes. And kind of what I alluded to on the message to you was there's been huge shifts, thankfully, fortunately, the past 5, 10 years in terms of talking about mental health on more broadly. But I think a few years back, where we were acknowledging more of things, especially with the male plight and the exponential
mm.
rise in male suicide cases, that's still been 73, 74% globally. And I'm always cautious when I talk about these things because I think people can sometimes confuse your intent with a
Yeah.
whataboutism, but actually we talk about all of these really important things
What I would
in
say
equal
though, I
measure
mean, I know I get that
sometimes. So
leveled at me a lot, and I do actually genuinely feel like whataboutery can actually be a legitimate position to take within the area of men and boys advocacy, because there is, in my opinion, there is certainly a double standard where, like we talked about knife crime just a minute ago, but obviously I live in London. Knife crime is a serious issue. I sit and watch young black boys get stabbed to death every single year. I talk about it all the time. Maybe 20, maybe 30 a year. Often some years, every single teenager killed in London by a knife crime is male. No one hears anything, and then suddenly that tragedy hits a young woman, which is also tragic, and then that becomes a massive cultural movement. You'll see Sadiq Khan on his soapbox yet again talking about this epidemic of violence against women and girls, which I understand, but I never saw him say anything about violence against men and boys, despite knife crime overwhelmingly impacting men and boys. So that's an example of where I'm like, what about is a legitimate thing? Is it draws attention to the fact that we have a double standard in compassion, an empathy gap, people call it, and I think in that instance and others, whataboutery is a legitimate thing that we shouldn't be afraid of using. But it also is illegitimate. Sometimes you do see men bringing up these issues as a means of undermining women's discussion. That exists too, but I wouldn't say whataboutery is wholesale a bad thing. But go on.
and that works no, that works on inverse as well, right? Because I found that sometimes when I've spoken about the
Mm.
male plight or male issues, it's not to diminish what women experience by any stretch of the imagination. I even try to caveat, I think, that with some necessary nuance in captions, but we know captions
Oh.
in Instagram, especially, don't really allow you to explore all of that and sometimes be met with whataboutery about my apparent whataboutism,
Yeah,
which
in
is
whataboutery
and
squared,
ironic.
I'd call it.
Yes, yeah, if that exists. But I do find the last 5 years, especially, and I'll be interested to get your take on this. That there has been
Yeah.
there's more conversation about
Mm.
male suicide, male mental health, but growingly almost a more societal apathy towards it, like
Mm.
a roll of the eyes or jeers or again, whataboutery about the whataboutery squared. Call it that. I think that's going to stick. I'm stealing that, if nothing else, from this podcast.
You're welcome.
Whataboutery squared. Where do you think that has come from? Because we've seen the Me Too movement. We've seen, thankfully, women have fought for many more things, and they're getting more social standing, more of a voice. We look at the organizational constructs, parental leave, and all of these things to do with women. But where has this apathy towards the male plight
I
come
mean,
from,
I
do you
don't think
believe?
apathy towards men and boys has been a particularly modern invention. I think perhaps we notice it more because we're shining a light on it through like the work of people such as myself and others as well. But I feel like we've our entire lives, and for as long as I've been around, like I don't think we ever talked about men and boys. Even historically, we often talk about the pain and suffering of women historically, which is important. And important to talk about how women were suppressed. But then it wasn't as if men, like historically, been walking around sort of just counting their money. Each of us, the CEO of our own company, like the historical experiences of men have been traumatic as well. Again, like whataboutery, we often talk about intergenerational violence, so intergenerational trauma, and how it can be passed down through families, which is true, up to 3 generations, some research says. And that's often framed in the context of like racial intergenerational trauma, which is important as well. But I've never heard intergenerational trauma talked about in terms of lived experiences of men, fathers, granddads, serving in the war especially, who have seen things and experienced things that are just unimaginable to people like us. And I've never seen men talked about in the context of intergenerational trauma, or the historical suffering of men, or the suffrage of men. Like I always like reminding people that for the vast majority of history, virtually no one could vote, including men. And when women won the right to vote 100 years ago, so did men. The majority of men also couldn't vote. And that seems to be erased in our sort of historical revisionist narrative of gender. And I don't know
Mm.
if you went back in time 500 years ago and you would see the life of a woman suppressed at home, turned into a baby making machine, educating her own children, or her husband who was stuffed down a mine shaft to die. I'm not sure whose life you'd want to live. I'd say they're both pretty bad, and I'm grateful I've got this one. So I don't want to paint this narrative that it's always excellent being a guy. Historically, it's always been horrible being a woman. And yeah, I just think that I don't. I feel like we've been apathetic to that for quite a while, and that apathy hasn't just appeared recently. It's just that we've become perhaps more conscious of it, and think like about time.
Mm. Do you think some of this stems from
Yeah,
almost these luxury
yeah,
beliefs and positions
yeah.
of privilege we have, personal problems? And I think there will be some people that say, "Oh, it's harder now than it's
Outrageous.
ever been," and
That's so.
I mean, it's just we have so much more awareness, and with these rising stats in the global mental health burden, I guess there's so many factors at play. Is it just the more people are speaking about it? Is there more diagnosis? The DCO-75 has obviously exploded in terms of diagnostic and the implications and the medical interventions that are available to people. There's so much more to consider. And I think, speaking as an elder millennial, how many
How old
years
am
younger are
I?
you, if you don't mind me?
30, 35 now.
Yes. Not that it really matters, but I'm just you're falling into a
Mm.
similar camp to me, I guess. We're very similar in age. We're kind of we
Yeah,
are in a
no one
luxurious
ever.
position. I think this is
Everyone talks about how
one
privileged I am,
but
which is absolutely correct. I am, but everyone thinks I'm privileged because I'm like a man, and that is in some ways a privilege. But the biggest privilege I have is first of all being born in the UK, which is one of the most advanced countries in the world. I'm grateful for. Secondly, I'm middle class, and the class divide remains the biggest divide of all. Forget about like gender, sexuality, and race. Class, and that's the biggest shortcoming in my opinion of the left. They're just disinterested in class, and they're disinterested in talking about working class people. And then a third is that I'm born today, and perhaps the biggest privilege. I'm born like not literally today, but born in this current era where I, you know, up until about 1800s, there's about 50-50 chance that you die before your fifth birthday. So I'm grateful that I'm not subject to that, and I feel like everyone who's alive today should share in that gratitude, especially people in the UK, especially in the middle class. Like you've got it
mm,
pretty good, and we need to be talking about the working class especially, and not centering the whole conversation on a very select few Eurocentric middle class. What do you call them? Like a sort of privileged sort of complaints that are just not. I wouldn't put them at the top of the ladder in terms of priority.
yeah, because I think that generational thing is almost. I feel like I'm speaking from a point of personal exposure here. Is modern manhood or masculinity is almost we're being held account for
Mm,
the actions of our forefathers, the patriarchs, and things instilled there. But also, there is a current society that wants more from us, wants so much more change. But it's that change is tough because there are still men because there's pressures from
Mm.
other men to be a certain way. So I almost like this identity shift and what men feel they should be is a real struggle because they want to embody some of the classic archetypal structures of what it apparently means to be a man and what masculinity is, but also they're making a conscious shift because we were probably caught up in things like social status, getting a good job, earning a certain amount of money, but that at the same
Mm.
time not defining us. So it's a really, and I can hear all the tiny little violins out there right now. It's a weird time to be a man.
Yeah, well, we've seen women go through a very important shift in terms of finding what is a woman, like in terms of where do women find meaning in life. And obviously, historically, up until about 50 years ago, their meaning in many people's eyes was just to reproduce children, which is obviously a deeply misogynistic, narrow view of womanhood. And quite rightly, the last 50 or 60, 70 years, we've seen women add loads of different things. We've seen them emerging into the workplace, becoming financially autonomous beings. They've got control of their reproductive rights, at least in the UK they do. And then they've added to what they had. So obviously still maintaining that sort of family importance and the importance of motherhood and the importance of friendships. But now they've added, quite rightly, like career, money. And I don't think we've seen the same thing happen to men, where men are still stuck in their archetypal 1950s style breadwinner provider role. And we've not expanded that sufficiently beyond that to include all the things that women have, such as the family and fatherhood. I don't see why a man should find any more meaning or purpose from being a CEO than he should being a dad. I'm like, they're both equally rewarding in their own unique ways, and
Mm,
perhaps it's not impossible to have both. So that's we're taking men out of those man boxes as they're called. But I'm also very conscious of a second set of man boxes that are presented to men, such as toxic masculinity, male violence, and patriarchy. They're just, for me, they're just another type of stereotypes, just as harmful, just as limiting, and just as inaccurate of the vast majority of men. And I'm very conscious of not wanting to take men out of one set of man boxes, only to put them into a second set of man boxes. And I would just encourage men: you are an individual, autonomous being, and you're able to you can exercise and express yourself in whichever way you feel most fit. That doesn't make you any more or less valuable than any other man. And it doesn't mean you toxic. It doesn't make you
mm,
patriarchal. It doesn't make you violent. Those are just more generalizations that most men don't fit into either.
mm. I think like most Insta sound bites, this roll off the tongue
Yeah.
jargon, if you like, often
No.
has little thought behind it. You know, there's especially with toxic, the word toxic. I'm not a fan of the word toxic just because it's been overused, and I think there are people that are exposed to truly
Mm,
traumatic and toxic environments that would almost feel like their
mm.
plight is diminished somewhat because someone put too much milk in someone else's latte and that makes them a toxic narcissist
Yeah.
or whatever it may be. But this stuff just rolls off the tongue. I don't think there's any thought or meaning behind it. But it's interesting in terms
Yeah.
of like concept creep and how people talk about things because you mentioned misogyny there, and I find sometimes typically
Mm,
misogyny is a hatred for women, whereas sometimes it could be man or woman that is
mm,
disagreeing with another woman, and they are
mm.
a misogynist. Whereas
Yeah.
that's just
Yeah.
disagreement. We're just disagreeing because I've disagreed with something a woman says. Whether a woman says it to another woman, it's not misogyny or subconscious bias or by any stretch of the imagination. It's just
Yeah, I mean, it feels like
what it
we are
is.
applying the term misogyny in areas that they're not warranted, but then also simultaneously not applying it in areas where it is
Mm,
warranted. Like, I feel like there's an unaddressed undercurrent of that benevolent misogyny that seems to think women are incapable of anything bad. So, like anything a woman does, like a lot of people are very much supportive of women's autonomy, but when it's her autonomy to do something bad, such as become an abuser or sexual predator, like we just totally ignore that. Like there's so many times in the news you'll see like sexy cougar in school has sexual relationship with 14-year-old boy, and I'm like, first of all, that is extraordinarily harmful to the boy, but also you're painting a very dim view of women in the sense that you're just alleviating any sort of agency or autonomy from her. Because ultimately, that's what autonomy is. Autonomy is to do whatever you want, good or bad. That's not my choice. That's the whole point. And similarly, for like a woman that might want to be a stay-at-home mum, like a lot of people don't respect that, and they think that women's values should be you know smashing the patriarchy and becoming a career woman and becoming a successful whatever career. And I'm like, that is true for some women, but also it's also true that some women just want to be a mum, and they genuinely want to be a mum. They're not internally oppressed. That is genuinely what they want to do with their life, and there was literally nothing wrong with that. Same for stay-at-home dads. So
Mm.
I'm keen to also draw attention to this benevolent form of misogyny that paints women as sort of saintly creatures and just limits their actions to only good things, rather than seeing women as human beings, just like men, just as capable of both good and bad as a man. It's like they're just human beings, like brilliant and flawed.
Yeah, I think part of the narrative that feeds into that is we know the social media, especially, or all media,
Yeah.
likes the polarized, and this often warped perception of
Mm.
what it is to be a woman, arguably femininity, and what feminist activists place on women, rather than saying feminism is what body
Mm.
autonomy, what you think it should be, whether that is at home mum or that is a highly driven career woman. Because I think there's something else in there as well amongst this, the societal pressures of
Mm.
parent work life
Mm.
balance. Well, clearly that's very subjective. That's something very different to everyone else. But to almost make the plight for women easier, we need to address some of these male issues as well, because you spoke there, stay-at-home dads. There are not the things, the construct in place for
Yeah.
parental leave,
No.
for example, of
Yeah.
men,
Well, they're not,
which contribute positively to that dynamic instead of
yeah. I mean,
creating
the amount of
division.
good that would be felt by women and men and society as a whole if we were able to give fathers the same rights as mothers, both in terms of child custody and also in terms of what you said in terms of parental leave, would be enormous. Like there'd be a massive benefit to everybody. But we're still not willing to do it. And not only just in
Mm.
terms of legal equality, in terms of fathers are legally entitled to the same parental leave as mothers, but also just the way in which society sees fatherhood as seemingly less valuable than motherhood. And you see it everywhere. You see it in our politicians are quite literally saying that fatherhood shouldn't be seen as harmonious to sort of family life, or fatherhood isn't part of a cohesive family unit, which is Harriet Harman, to name her. Dreadful, awful thing to say, like bigoted. And the Labour Party have still not apologised for that, even though the ramifications of this devaluing of fatherhood and the fatherlessness that inevitably ensued has now led to some of the things I'm talking about, one of which being knife crime, as you mentioned, and now they're blaming men for that too. And I'm like, Harriet, if you had not said this thing about fatherhood, perhaps there would be more fathers in the homes of these boys, and those boys wouldn't be going out and joining gangs and picking up knives. And perhaps you should accept some of the accountability you endlessly talk about, like accountability for everybody, including yourself. But that never seems to happen. So we just seem to deride fatherhood and masculinity more generally in the media as well. So like in the old days, you'd have like amazing like Uncle Phil and Mr. Rogers, amazing archetypes of fatherhood. And now we've just got like Peter Griffin, Homer Simpson, these deadbeats, doofus dads that are just poor representations of fatherhood. And there's been studies on that as well in terms of the emergence of inept dads in sitcoms and in advertising, and how that's also quite a modern thing. And a great way to do it is to go to like a card store and look at all the Father's Day cards, and then look at all the Mother's Day cards, and it's quite stark in the way we view fatherhood and motherhood as of different values, which is outrageous. So equally valuable culturally, socially, and equal sort of legal rights, I think, would for fathers be a massive benefit to everybody, including mothers and children, most of all, I think.
Yeah,
Mm.
children are the future,
Yeah.
not to quote Whitney. But
Oh, I know they are.
sorry, I couldn't resist that. But yeah, in terms of that, I think like the male plight when it comes to often what's discussed in psychological terms, like the mother wound and how impactful and
Mm.
important the mother is, which absolutely I concur. I totally agree with that. But what's being spoken about more, what I've been reading about, is the father wound and how important that male role model is, and not just in terms of being the breadwinner, being strong, being stoic, emotionally regulated, all those kind of things, but actual
Mm.
providing care. We speak about men in terms of provider financially,
Mm.
but what about caregivers as well? It's often
Yeah,
something that
and
we don't
just like
discuss.
in the socializing boys, especially during like very difficult hormonal periods in their life, like teenage, like the teenage years, being a boy, obviously we both know, is very difficult, and sometimes you do need that male role model either at school or at home to sort of talk you through it. And there is only so much I think a mother can understand that, in the same way as that a dad may not understand what it's like to be a young hormonal teenage girl. And there's nothing wrong with saying that. And I always think about this story I read, true story about elephants, where in Kruger National Park in South Africa, they had a massive poaching problem with elephants. So they basically took the elephants into like a refuge to repopulate them. And after a generation, it was great, it was so successful. So they decided to bring the elephants back to Kruger, but the helicopter could not lift up the male bull elephants, the fathers. So they got left behind, and the women and children were taken to Kruger. And then in about 6 months' time, there were a massive sort of spate of deaths in big game animals like rhinos being gored to death, which was totally unusual. Like, you just don't really see that. And then the park rangers were like, well, we need to see what's going on here. So they observed, and they saw like marauding bands of young juvenile male elephants. The very male elephants had lost their fathers, and they were basically going around killing these animals for sport, for literally no reason other than for fun. So they were like, well, maybe if we went and brought the dads back with a bigger helicopter, that might solve the problem. And it did. It solved the problem almost immediately, because those, in the similar way that boys experience testosterone, puberty, elephants experience musk, which is the sort of elephant, sort of the same thing. And they needed that male modelling behaviour for an adult male who's been through it to help these young juvenile males to understand what they're going through and process it. And like I said, they brought them back together, and the goring stopped. And it's impossible not to hear that story as a Londoner and not see that as directly comparable to knife crime, and how many boys leave the home because there is no father, looking for a sense of belonging elsewhere. Often see it in a gang, a sense of leadership and belonging, family, and they pick up a knife instead. And that's the same. Or they'll go and follow someone like Andrew Tate, who's just as harmful, equally misogynistic. So that whether, like, just because dads aren't at home as much as they were, like, boys are still looking for that father figure, but now they're just looking in places that are actually going to harm them. And yeah, that elephant story is great. You should check it out. It's really, really interesting. It is.
Well, that's incredibly fascinating. I definitely will check that out. I have no idea. And
Mm.
aside our evolution with our brains and limbic system and all of that, I think we are animals essentially. And actually, I'm sure you've come across it, but really fascinating. But I forget the author's name, but I always remember the title. It's A History of Human
Wow.
Violence, Demonic Males. And it talks about, gangs and certain behaviors that are still apparent
Mm.
with primates nowadays. Certain different species of primates, and we're
Mm.
not dissimilar at all. So there are I know there's that naturalistic fallacy that
Yeah.
tends to try to explain a lot, but I'm sure
Yeah.
there's no denying that. There's epigenetics, but also inherently what we're programmed to be and behave like. And I think that male figure growing up, with juveniles is quite important
Mm.
to both the grown adult as well
Mm.
as the child growing up
Yeah. Well,
within
I
that
guess, like,
community.
just to put that in terms of policy, like, that's why we need youth clubs back in cities. Like, we need somewhere for young males to go, especially to stop them from doing these things. Because gangs know this, and that's why they target boys from fatherless homes, because they know they're vulnerable, and that's like just well understood. And not only that, but obviously having a father at home is just greater across the board in most cases. Like, it's not just about giving a sense of sort of psychological, like, boundaries, but in terms of just the economic benefits as well, and also the support for the mother. And like fatherhood is an essential part of harmonious family unit, unlike what Harriet Harman seems to think. And it's about time we reminded people of that.
Mm. Yeah, I know there's a lot more research that's going into complex PTSD and trauma experienced by younger children as well, and just the breaking up of that home dynamic, because both parties are
Mm.
equally important in that dynamic. So even if you've got a very present father that is very actively involved in their child's life, just the presence
Mm.
of them not at home, I'm sure that has implications. That's just speculative on my part, but I'd be really interested to see how that research evolves and what comes out of that, into how crucial just having
Mm.
a positive male role model, family home, as well as a positive female role model is important for
Same, and
development
also
of
like yeah,
children.
absolutely. And I guess the other part of the problem is that boys don't often, like 1 in 4 boys in America, for example, don't have a father at home, and then the problem is only exacerbated and compounded further by the fact that the vast majority of teachers in school are also female. So there's like I think it's like only about 20% of schools have, only 20% of classrooms have a male teacher. 1 in 4 schools in the UK have no male teacher in that school whatsoever. So you can see there's just a massive lack of positive male role models and sort of role modeling for boys, and we all pay the price of that.
I think historically as well, even primary school, I don't remember. I think I had
Oh
one
yeah, I
male
had one,
primary
and then he
school
left
teacher.
after 1 year. So then back to all women.
Yeah, I mean, typically and broadly speaking, there are more female teachers in general, but I think that whittles down to
Yeah,
just a few
and also
men in primary
and the
school.
lower you go, the worse it
And
gets. So in university lecturers and stuff, it's not so bad. It's probably about equal. But when you move down to like high school, primary school, and especially kindergarten, it's crazy. Like the numbers in America. So in kindergarten, there are more women flying military jets as a share of the population in America than there are men teaching kindergarten. About 3 times more, I think. And it's like
wow,
that's how crazy it's gotten. And like we just need, like, how many kids are going to be in kindergarten? No male role model. Go home, no male role model. And like the damage of that is clear. And that's not to shame single motherhood. It's just to remind us that fathers are also important and men have a role too.
but just this, I guess the societal perspective on that is over here, at least. I think that would probably be frowned upon. I mean, they make films about
Mm,
it. Daddy Daycare with Eddie
yeah, yeah.
Murphy, for example. That I was watching that. I was watching that with my 7-year-old daughter not so long ago, and even the way the movie pans out, I just think two random guys that have left their job to set up a nursery should be fine. But
No,
could that
yeah,
happen these days?
yeah.
Probably not. Probably very
Yeah, I get that all the
suspiciously
time.
looked
Like if I
at.
go for like a walk through the park with my girlfriend, I think she quite understood it until like a little girl cycled past us not long ago and fell off her bike and started crying. And my girlfriend sort of stepped forward to make sure she's okay, and I stepped back. And then she's like, "Why do you step back?" And I was like, "Because people will probably think I'm some sort of pervert or paedophile." Like honestly, like you just do not like you just looked at it in a very different way, and in like this whole idea of like the whole male vilification, and how that narrative is perpetrated by all sides of society, including the left. The idea of like men are inherently violent, inherently predatory, and how that impacts perfectly reasonable, kind men from helping girls. And also, like, and it hurts, like, most of all, hurts black people, black men. Like, the vilification of black men is being directly fed into by this hostile view of masculinity in general. And the people on the left that are propping up this very narrow view of male violence in a very alarmist way to create a cultural panic, I don't think they've realised that black men are going to pay the biggest price of that through things like police brutality. And it's like, this is a big tangent, but it was truly incredible to see 1 year everyone talking about police brutality and how many black men are killed by police. And then the next year, in the wake of the Sarah Everard death, people were like fanning the flames of male violence, talking about how dangerous men are, quite literally feeding to the very problem 1 year prior they were advocating against. And it's like you're actually now creating the very problem you claimed to care about. And like I said, the vast majority of black Americans killed by police are black men, like 99% or more. So it's certainly a gendered issue, and it's certainly caused by a fear of men and a fear, especially of black men. Anyway, that is a large tangent, but an important one. I thought I'd give that to you as well.
Yeah, I think so. 'Cause I was just thinking when you was discussing that as well is how torn a lot of men feel because exactly as you mentioned there is you stood back almost because of
Mm,
how other people may have viewed you there, but also on the point of Sarah Everard is there was almost a cry for more men to get physically involved in gender dynamics in public. So a man and wife arguing and him
mm,
talking to her in a disrespectful way that men should forward. So almost the demand for men to put themselves in physical harm's way, but also the inner struggle of I don't want to step in and it seemed to be like virtue signaling in some way. Am I perpetuating the situation by encouraging the violence? Am I meant to get
mm.
involved or am I meant to step back? Am I to encourage empowered women and not to involve myself at all? Like, what do I do?
Just, I
What do I
mean,
do in these situations?
I don't know, but I mean, men do step in. Men, the vast majority of bystander rescues are by men. Like, I understand that if there's a man with a knife committing a crime, we expect that to be a man. But then if there's a burning building, you're also expecting a man to be the one kicking down the door and dragging you out. And it's interesting how you only bring up one side of that. In going back to Sarah Everard, a man did exactly what you described the following week, where a woman tried to end her life by diving into the Thames and killing herself, and then some random man didn't even know her dived in after her to save her. He lost his life, she was saved. Never heard that really mentioned, and certainly not in the context of like male heroism. It's like we're obsessed with blaming men for violent acts, which is fair enough, fine, do that. But then, then should men also be praised for the heroism of other men? Like, are we only held accountable for the bad things and never credited for the good? Personally, I just feel like we should be treated as individuals. So neither of those, but it would make sense to be consistent, and that would remind us that men do step in, because like there's been a lot of knife attacks in London, and it is almost always men that are stepping in and are risking their lives and losing their lives to save others, including women. And I just fundamentally don't believe we've
Yeah.
normalised violence against women, if I may say that, as highly controversial, because men who perform heinous sexual acts towards women, when they go to prison, for example, which is in many people's eyes sort of seen as I guess, the epicenter of criminality and poor masculine, those sexual predators are at such risk to those men that they have to be sectioned out. Like those sexually violent men towards women are absolutely hated across society to the point where even in prisons they're not welcome and they will probably be killed or worse. So although there are certainly people who do normalise male violence, I don't think it's as widespread as people like to suggest. And also, more controversially, I feel like violence towards men is what is truly normalised. And like think about again sexual assault in male prisons. Like we're talking like hundreds of thousands of instances of sexual assault in American prisons. It's like a joke. People laugh at it. Like, don't drop the soap. That is real normalisation. And even more controversial, piling it up now, if you also include sexual assault in prisons, there are more male victims of sexual assault in America than female. So take what you want from that. Highly unpopular things to say, but I know, worth talking about. That's not to say violence against, just to clear that up, but just
Well,
say,
yeah.
obviously, there are violent men and women who are victims of violence against women, and they are important too. I'm just trying to put that in a bit of a context for you.
And that is the sweet spot, I think, the necessary and grey. And I think with all these conversations around gender dynamics is arguably you've got an individual that has their limited
Mm,
life experience through their lens, through their biases, everything they've experienced, that are making broad assumptions and categorical conclusions based on what men are or what women are. When you mention individuality, there's so
mm,
much context and nuance in those conversations, and that's what we should be looking at. But the media, we know, the media doesn't do that; it just does the polarize
yeah,
what's going to capture
yeah.
attention. You mentioned saintly creatures a while back, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more on that because on the point of misogyny, how do you feel
Ah,
about misandry?
I mean, it's thrown around quite often, isn't it? And I mean, both. I think both. We need to sort of tone it down on both sides. Like anything, people, like you said, anyone disagrees a woman is often called a misogynist, when in fact they're just disagreeing a woman. And disagreeing a woman and treating her as an adult is nothing. Is the complete opposite of misogyny. So I would give that same advice to those who band around misandry as a just colloquial term. I do think it exists. It's amazing the sort of articles and tweets you can read. Like I retweeted Judy Bindel just yesterday because she's the one that's taking men to task for misogyny, and yet she wrote an article not well for the Guardian that literally was called "Why I Hate Men," and then she went on about why she hates men, and I'm like, are you actually the person to take others to task for their own bigotry? I don't think you really are, and that's like she's a nationally renowned feminist author writing articles in the Guardian. No one seems to mind those things, and it's like you see on social media, you see some of the horrible things said about men under the guise of advocacy, and it's not. Like, I genuinely feel like toxic masculinity is inherently a bigoted idea that is, it presents itself as a kindness, a kind form of advocacy, but it's just not. And you can see how easily it's contorted by malefactors to basically blame men for anything and everything, for everyone, and for all of time. So, yeah, I would say misandry is pretty prevalent. I don't know which one's more prevalent. I guess that's besides the point. But I think people even know what that word is. I always think it's funny when I write a post about word and I do my spell check at the end, and that's never recognised as a real word. Like misandry, yeah, it's like misogyny, yeah, that's great, that's a
Okay.
word. But misandry, it's like, what is that? And I'm like, that's you really captured it there. Thank you, InDesign. And the same for Google. It's like, what is this? But it's becoming. I think it's becoming well
Yeah.
understood. And I think people are
And
actually
that
understanding
is,
there's a word for that.
that's a good start for a lot of people. Yeah, because everyone would have heard of misogyny. But no, I've just noticed, I guess, the rise in, as you say, from perhaps more the activist movement is just that stuff that broadly condemns men for what they are, how they behave, toxic this, toxic that. Is, look, there is a fair share of
Mm.
inherently bad men out there. There is also a fair share of very unkind, unhappy, based on their experiences, women that are projecting a lot of that into the world. That, as you say,
It's inter-
is
it's
passable.
interesting.
You see it written
You're
in places
interesting how you
every day.
caveated horrible women with awful past experiences, which is a very good caveat to add, and an important one to add. That women, that some of these harmful women, have themselves been harmed, in the sense that hurt people, but you didn't add that caveat for bad men. Do you think men are inherently bad, or do you think men are also the product of their environment and experiences, just as women?
No, no, I guess
Yeah,
that's an important subconscious bias there, maybe. Or maybe I did over caveat because I'm
yeah,
prepared for the flack I'm going to get for
yeah. Well,
discussing this in
that's
general, which is another unfortunate thing. I think even if we were to have a 10-hour podcast talking about these things in equal measure, based on someone's subjective experience, male or female, they would draw their own conclusions based on something you
well.
likely wouldn't have
When
said
I
at
when I
all.
have someone come up to me that doesn't like me and hates me, or just hates men in general, I try to return to my core principle of no one is inherently bad, no one is born bad. So this person who hates me might and probably does have a string of poor experiences at the hands of men, perhaps for their entire life, that has turned them into this person. And instead of seeing them as an end product, like a static object, I should ask, what journey have they been on to hate men or me this much? Like, what have they experienced? And can I perhaps talk to that person? Can I talk to that vulnerable person who's maybe scared or unsure or traumatized, and not see them as inherently bad by virtue of their gender, which is not something that is afforded to men. Men are just painted as inherently bad by virtue of their gender. They're born bad. That's it. We don't grant men that goodwill. Like, even violent. Like, there's that woman that stabbed her boyfriend to death 100 times and never got sentenced to prison because she was seen as the product of her own trauma, and she was addicted to drugs, and she was in some sort of like psychotic breakdown, which is, I have some understanding of that, but we never apply that to men. A man is just inherently bad, and in the same way that we alleviate women of autonomy of their own actions, including and especially so the criminal actions, they're not responsible for that. We don't do that for men, and we make them accountable for other men's actions as well. So I will be held accountable for Wayne Cousins, even though I'm not violent whatsoever. So it's like we're giving men too much accountability and women not enough, or too much agency and women not enough. And there's so many great examples of that. Like even in Me Too, which you mentioned, when Rose McGowan quite rightly stood up to the men, the predatory men in Hollywood, she blamed men as a whole. Like, this is men. Men did this and women towed the line, she would say. And then her friend, Asia Argento, she was accused of sexually assaulting, raping a boy. And then suddenly Rose McGowan saying that we don't know what's going on, we're not sure what happens, we need to go easy on her, she said. And I'm like, that is just a complete inconsistency of accountability, in my opinion. Yeah,
Outright hypocrisy,
also like a
some might
broken.
say. Because that was something I actually wanted to speak to you about because, rightly so, certain figures have been called
Mm.
out and held accountable for their actions. But we had a brief conversation about the likes of, well, it evolved out of your post about Billie Eilish, what she said, no one ever says anything bad about male bodies.
Well,
But I
no,
think that
not
also
no one.
comes
It was
to
women don't say anything bad
allege,
about male bodies.
oh, sorry, women. I stand corrected. Yes, but when it comes to things like alleged sexual support, because it's not always been followed up or taken through, the
Mm.
likes of Terry Crews have spoken a bit openly about that. James Van Der Beek as well, I've seen, have spoken quite publicly about how, they've had their genitals touched in public by managers and things like that. But when that issue is brought up, and something I wanted to speak to you a bit more about was male objectification in general, because I think I shared on one of your stories my experience of that, and we objectify ourselves, and we are objectified, and part of that is I can think of many occasions over the years where
Mm.
I've had my chest groped, or I've had pinched, or I went to a fitness expo many years ago, and I think you do have some understanding of the fitness space. It's a weird space. So I'm conscious that explaining this to someone that doesn't have an understanding of the fitness space, it
Mm.
makes it even stranger. But it was standing on a nutrition stand, and the marketing manager at the time asked someone that wanted a picture. That sounds a bit gross for me to even say that out loud. Do you want his shirt on or off?
God.
And even
That
that, I
is,
thought at the time, and
wow.
probably as a younger man, I didn't really have the confidence to question that out loud, or even delve a bit deeper and say, is that just something I'm a bit uncomfortable with, or is that just? But I think every subsequent expo I went to after that, these concerns I had about my body, and would that be asked of me again, and would that be asked of other women? Like, I'm no victim in this situation. I just want to caveat that I'm not crying about this, and probably my over caveating it is because I know the societal view of that, because it is often met with eye rolls or jeers,
Yeah,
or that's all right, or in some way
that's what.
it should be flattering. It should be
Well, they're
flattering when
committing the
it's
same
asked
errors
that.
that women
But
experience. Like it's the exact same thing that misogynistic men mostly said about women, where it's like, oh no, it's a compliment, and it's like it's not a compliment. And it's like the exact same thing. It's like we've learned this lesson, but yet here we are again making the same mistake.
and in the vein of, I guess, objectification in general, that came naturally from feminist research, and it was typically of the archaic view of women are
Mm.
pretty little things for men, for breeding, used for their sexual desires, and that is how they should view themselves and value themselves through the eyes of others. Almost to counter the objectification of women, rather than acknowledge objectification as a whole is an issue. It's almost like the equality shift has
Mm.
been, let's objectify men, let's highly sexualize men as well. And I think that's something that's not often spoken about, is that we talk about the sexual objectification of women, but a counter to the objectification of them has just been,
Yeah,
let's just
yeah,
objectify men
and it's
just as
like, or
much.
yeah, like feeding into the very problem itself, rather than seeing it as an issue.
Yeah.
And I always, I suppose, I don't have a slogan, but if I were to have a slogan, it'd be like treat the issue, not the gender. And the issue is sexual harassment and sexual
Mm.
assault. And we can argue that women are more vulnerable to that, but we need to still see it as a complete issue. And I think the majority of men have experiences such as the one you shared. I'm very sorry to hear that. Sounds horrible. And I've had similar things. I mean, I remember when I was on a date last year in London. I remember the girl I was with went to the toilet and she left a handbag under. I thought she left the handbag under the table, and then was bending over to have a look to make sure I didn't leave it there. And some random woman just went and pinched my bum, and then let's turn around and she just thinks it's hilarious. And I'm like, there are so many men of those experiences,
Mm.
and I don't consider myself a victim either. Obviously not, but I was just like, you're just an idiot. But it's not as if men don't have these
Mm.
experiences, and it's fine. But it's not fine, but it happened to us because we're older. But when it happens to younger and younger men, especially boys, and when you see a sexual assault against boys, especially by like adult teachers, babysitters, waved away by the news itself as some sort of taboo, like flirty thing, not what it, rather than what it is. It's like, what damage does that do to our boys? And how is that? We're constantly telling boys to do better.
And other men and boys, boys, is just literally getting
Yeah,
applause for that. Oh, you slept with
I,
your teacher, who was essentially
I
a
saw an
paedophile in
article
this situation.
just this year, and it was a woman that was saying she had a sexy threesome with two 14-year-old boys. And I'm like, that wasn't a threesome. You raped two boys there. That's what you did, and now you should be going to prison. And it's not. You see it in the news. It's like 15-year-old boy has sexual relationship with teacher. And I'm like, what? Or it's like a teenage boy flirts with teachers. Like, she's grooming him. She's grooming him. Like, use the real words. That links back to a little bit about the whole benevolent misogyny, where we don't think women can do that, so we have to frame it in some other way, in a way in which she is innocent, and we'll frame her as some sort of saucy cougar, which is stupid. And I don't think we just haven't even begun to look at female paedophiles and how they target boys, and how the problem is in teaching, for example, and how often it happens, because it's just not seen. And whenever we talk about boys in the context of sexual violence, it's only ever about educating them, and never about educating ourselves on the vulnerability of those boys too. Because boys, like 1 in 6 boys, will be sexually assaulted before he's 18. Never see anyone being educated on that. We only ever educate the boys. And not to mention the fact that, again, in the same way, same reciprocal manner, to educate boys to understand sexual violence against them is also to help solve the problem of sexual violence by them. Like, a boy who experiences sexual violence is probably more likely to commit sexual violence. So we're only hurting ourselves indirectly too by not actually talking about boys as genuinely vulnerable members of society to sexual assault. And we see sexual assault as only something that happens to girls, and only girls should be protected. And I've got loads of stories of girls sexually assaulting me in school, and that maybe that would not have happened had we not had that narrative. And perhaps we treated the issue rather than the gender. Boys like me and boys today that are still happening to would actually be protected. But we're not really interested in that. We're interested more in just playing politics, and that's a massive, just a tragic sort of short-sightedness on our behalf.
And you're incredibly well versed in this, so please do correct me if I mess it up. But even the legal terms around rape and what
Mm.
constitutes as rape is very different. So you rightly said as that teacher raped those
Well,
boys,
yeah,
but in
you're
legal
absolutely right.
terms,
I'm wrong. You actually are. She did not rape them, because legally you have to have a penis to commit rape by UK law. So nothing a woman does to either an adult man or even a boy will ever be seen as rape, because to be a rapist you have to have a penis, and like, it's literally written in the law. It's the act of penetration by a penis into an orifice of someone without their consent. And unless you have a penis, you can't be a rapist. And that's why when you get these stats saying 99% of rapists are men, which is absolutely true, it's because women can't commit rape. It's not that women aren't forcing men into, coercing them into having sex against their will or forcing them. It's because they literally cannot do it in the eyes of academia or the law. It's not possible. And in fact, obviously 1%, that stat says 1% of women are rapists. So clearly some women are being found guilty of rape. But that's only as a joint enterprise where they're acting alongside another man to help a rapist. And that's when a woman can actually be charged with rape, but not on her own. It's literally not possible. And we just do not know. Everyone's like, how many rape victims are there of men in the UK by women? I'm like, I don't actually know. I don't think anyone really knows, because no one's asking that question, because we're constantly sticking to this very narrow, antiquated model of rape that erases female perpetration and erases male victimhood and female victimhood of women, of course. But to answer that question, you can look at America, who had the same very narrow definition of rape, and they discovered that the FBI were missing 40% of rape cases because of that definition. So you can assume that perhaps 40% of victims, if you actually use a non-gendered model, are men. So not a small number in any sense. And it was interesting because it changed. Like, 1 year it was about 7 to 8% of rape victims are men. The next year it was 38%. And Lara Stempel, who's a feminist researcher, an excellent one, she was like, what the hell happened there? And it turns out we just changed the definition of rape, or America changed the definition. So we've yet to do that in the UK. There have been many petitions, many petitions, like dozens, asking for it to happen. They've all been rejected, and the government, quote, have no plans to change the legal definition of rape. That's a direct quote from 2020. But that's why it frustrates me. Everyone's like, well, MLAs aren't doing anything. And it's like, but they are. They're trying their best, but no one's helping them. And like, there's so many.
I think a lot of people will be incredibly surprised to hear that. I mean,
Mm,
I stumbled across it just from further investigation, not claiming I'm enlightened. I know this is work that you do, so you pay attention to these kind of things, but I stumbled across that by chance, and I was quite surprised in terms of UK
yeah.
legislation. So I'm hoping, some listeners take something away from that. But also, I think that brings about the question as, in another conversation around how men
Yeah,
come forward
and that
about
again,
being
it's not
raped.
just the legal system either. That
So,
translates into the way we talk about sexual violence, the way we advocate against sexual violence, intervene and help people, it's very gendered. And it's, to quote Gloria Steinem, which is not a habit of mine, but she said, to be it, you have to see it. And that's an excellent quote. But she was obviously talking about women in high, powerful CEO roles, but also to be it, to see it is true for men who are victims of abuse. Like if men who are victims of abuse never see themselves talked about, advocated for, never see themselves in campaigns, like why would they ever see themselves as a victim? And that explains why men are even less likely to report their sexual violence towards them than women. Like women often don't report either, but men are about 2.5 times less likely than that to report. And that also leads into very one-sided stats, because a lot of our stats are based on police reports or legal cases. And because men aren't reporting as much, they're underrepresented. So when I'm looking at data, I'm often looking at surveys where people have actually, like the CDC would go and call people up and ask them about their experiences, rather than waiting for them to file police reports, which often men don't do.
And amongst my reading, you know how you end up in a rabbit hole. The body for men, especially, well, men and women, which is why I guess there's so much guilt attached and shame attached to these heinous crimes, is the body's
Mm, mm,
involuntary response to things. So with men getting aroused, women getting aroused, they have this involuntary
mm,
response they're not necessarily in control of. So they almost
mm,
feel like they're
mm.
contributing to some way. You know, they
Yeah,
asked for it, or they
yeah. Or they're
deserved
lucky.
it.
Like 1 in 4 people think a man is lucky to be raped by a woman. Like that's how far away we are from justice. Like lucky, like the fortunate should be grateful. It's like that is shocking, and people do look at erections as some sort of thumbs up for consent, and that's just the same. Like I said, we've learned this lesson before, the same as before. Like we learned the same when we were like, oh, if a woman has an orgasm, that doesn't count as rape. It's obscenely bigoted idea, misogynistic. It's the same idea as a man who has erection is good to go, and it's not true. It's just an involuntary. Any man knows for a fact that you just do not get to choose. Like we've all had the embarrassing bus journeys or PE classes where it's like, no, not now, not now. And there's stories of like men who have been executed, like hung, getting erections, just because it's like a trauma response as well. So it's like you're literally responding to the trauma of being
Mm,
raped by getting an erection. And some people see that as a means of waving away as unimportant, or even as something you've actually consented to.
they
And
wanted
it's
it,
like, I
yeah.
wish we'd learned the lessons that women paid the price of that lesson for generations, and we've still not learned
Yeah.
it. Now we're subjecting men to the same blindsidedness. Oh,
Have you seen I May Destroy You on the
no.
BBC? It's a series, but it brings about lots of questions around consent,
Mm,
male and female dynamics, and what constitutes as consent and what doesn't. And I found it like an incredibly, I think it's only four to six episodes long, and it'd be on the iPlayer if anyone wants to tune in and watch it. But it really made me actually question my own
mm,
understanding of things as well, in a positive way. So yeah, I'd suggest if anyone's interested in that area of conversation, or that'd be, it's almost like you watch the whole thing and there's no
mm,
conclusive
mm.
definition as such, no matter how clear
Yeah,
in your
it's.
mind things may be. So I think, yeah, if anyone wants to watch that, I'd be interested to hear back from them. I wanted to ask you, because this was something you mentioned in our message exchanges, why you don't tend to comment on huge cultural popular issues. Because, forgive me if I've got this wrong, but you seem like a very
Mm,
nuanced left leaning, I'd even say.
yeah, no.
You're not right wing by any imagination, and nothing. I don't think I've read anything of yours that is controversial in the sense that it segregates gender dynamics more. It's just you're advocating for more one because that's what you're hugely passionate about. I
Mm,
don't see anything too
yeah.
controversial there.
Well,
I imagine some
I'd
of
go a
that.
step further and say I am
Uh,
more left wing than most people who claim to be left wing, because I advocate for the social equality of everybody.
mm,
I'm just expanding very left wing beliefs such as social equality. I'm expanding that to all people. So I would say that makes me more left wing. And the issues that I talk about, like homelessness, for example, is a men's issue and a left wing issue. And like no one ever sees, or BLM, for example, probably the biggest left wing issue of our time, at least in the last 5 years. Massive men's issue. Like I said, 96% of Americans killed by police are men. 99% of black Americans killed by police are men. And unless you're talking about that as both a racial and a gendered issue, I don't know if you really are left wing. And I mean, I don't want to get into some sort of purity contest, but yeah, that's what I think.
No, no, not at all. But why the
Oh, why do
avoidance, I
I?
guess,
So why
sometimes
do I?
we talk
I don't
about
like to
public
talk about
issues?
individual cases because I've learned that in a lot of feminist spaces they'll present very fringe behaviours of men. They'll take that like Wayne Couzens, a horrific murder that every man will be shocked by, and they'll present that as the norm. They'll be like, look at this awful man. This is the norm,
Mm.
rather than this is a violent man. They'll say men are violent, and here's an example. And I'm very keen not to do that. So when women do, I get sent all the time at horrific things women doing to like children and men, and I almost never post about it just because I don't. I just feel like it's not that helpful, and I will post about it if it gives me a chance to segue into a wider societal issue. So the Billie Eilish one is one I did post about because she said men don't experience insecurity on their bodies because women are nice, and that's just certainly not true. Women are just as big at ourselves as men are. But it allowed me to talk a little bit about the sort of things that men are insecure about, and it allowed me to talk about some of the horrible practices that men are enduring, such as limb lengthening surgery, to meet the expectations that women do often project onto them. So the need for a man to be tall, like men are now, and not just by women, but in general, like tall men get promoted more, they earn more. It's a huge problem no one talks about. And now men are having a surgery. It costs tens of thousands. They break your femur, put titanium extending tubes into your femurs and tibia fibia, and they'll extend it over the course of 6. Like it's so extraordinarily painful, and they're doing that a lot of the time to meet the
Mm.
expectations of women. So what really,
What tall, dark,
yeah,
handsome, only
exactly. And
6 foot.
Billie Eilish, what she said
Yeah.
was stupid, and it was a flippant thing to say, and I'm sure she regrets it. And I didn't want to make it all about her, but I did want to use that as a chance to talk about something more important. Like we did another post
Mm.
last week, really popular, about this thing called the impregnator, and there are these stats, there are these adverts that have come out. Yeah, crazy.
I must have
Basically, there's
missed
a
that article.
thing,
Yeah.
a product that's used to artificially inseminate, often gay women, so allowing gay women to have children, and they use it as this tool, which they, use your imagination. And now there's adverts on Twitter by the company that makes that, basically suggesting that women can use it to take a used condom out of a bin, and then basically inseminate themselves without the man's sort of consent or even knowledge. And that is an outrageous thing to do. And I'm absolutely not suggesting that a huge amount of women are doing that. I'm sure it happens. But that allowed me to talk a little bit about reproductive control and how many men are put into a position where they're forced into having children they don't want by women, like I guess stealthing, but the opposite. And the answer is that 1 in 10 American men are put in a position where they're with a partner who's trying to get pregnant against their will. So like sort of lying about the pill, or
Mm.
putting like a hole in the condom and whatever else. That's a serious problem.
Yeah.
The impregnated device is just a stupid meme that I use to get there. So I try not to do it unless it's a way of getting into a broader issue. And also it just drives engagement. These issues, these culturally relevant issues like Billie Eilish, are really popular on social media. So I'm trying to also harness that, but not exploit it. I don't want to exploit it to the point where I'm
Mm.
dividing people. But at the same time, that's where people are at, and they want to hear about it. So it's difficult.
Yeah, that's the great difficulty, isn't it, with social media, especially, and being a communicator like yourself is, getting the point
Mm,
across without making it a personal attack. But also, people have their own agendas. Like you'll often see comment sections just hijacked and
mm,
made about something else, or whether that's a personal attack. So rather than take it in its purest form, this person said
mm,
this, and let's talk about this more broadly. It's
mm,
what they
mm,
think you mean about that person and how
mm.
this how an attack on them. So I do take, especially when you've got a large platform as well, because
What,
you
a
must
lot
get
of
a lot of that.
flack? Not really.
Well, yeah,
People seem to think that I must be the most hated
no,
person on Instagram, but I'm really not.
I don't think that at all. I just wondered with, and maybe it's not you personally. I think that just maybe some of the other male advocate accounts I've seen have brought up male issues, and that's often you see the comment
Yeah.
section then
Oh yeah.
hijacked and made about other things. So there wasn't a
Oh
suggestion that
well.
you personally,
No.
by the way, just accounts
Yeah. I
advocating
mean,
for men in
okay.
general.
There's
And women's, I must say, I've seen, feminist accounts and men in there making
yeah.
pretty heinous comments
there's
about women that are actually
there's all yeah
nothing to
there
do
is
with the
often
post at
someone
all.
that'll come in, but not the majority. Just one or two people every now and again will come in and try and steer the conversation back to women.
Mm,
And I understand that, and I understand
yeah,
men do it. I don't get it much on my account because I think I try to have a
yeah.
civilized conversation, but it happens a lot. And it's so
Mm,
funny because that was the that was the reason why I set my account, because the Tin Men was never supposed to be about creating content. It was just a sock puppet account that I used to engage in conversation in comment other people's comment sections in a way that was genuinely good faith. That I was just constantly told, this isn't about you. This isn't
mm.
about you. This isn't about you. And I was like, I know that. That's the point. That you've literally.
Were you
Well,
were you
probably, yeah,
mansplaining?
always, whatever the hell that means.
Respectfully,
But yeah, no doubt. I mean, I can be extremely condescending arsehole, but that's just nothing to do with my gender, unfortunately. And I was just told, yeah, I've got
and I
no
know when I'm
problem.
doing
I'll
it.
take no offence to being called arrogant, condescending idiot. But I do take a little bit of offence on being called a mansplainer, like my gender's got any sort of relevance to it. But yeah, no, I was in like other people's comment sections, just wanting genuinely to like be like, oh, just so you know that 1 in 3 victims of abuse is a man, so it's important that we. I know you just get piled on. This isn't about that, and I'm like, I know it's not about that. That's the
Mm,
point though. Like it's never about us. Like never in terms of like male victims of abuse. I'm
mm,
like, stop telling me I've had my turn, because there's never been a turn for male victims of abuse, and we're still waiting like 50 years on. Anyway, then people were like, go make your own page, go make your own page, go make your own post. So I did,
mm,
and that's why I'm here. And now those same people come to my account demanding to talk
yeah.
about women, and I'm like, I made this account on my own to give men a voice. I'd prefer to make an account that speaks about women and men, but the reason I talk about men is only because no one else is. But now that person's here demanding I speak about women, and it's impossible. Like I had a sit down with a guy who gave me some feedback just on last week, and he said you should be really careful about bringing up women in your posts, to comparing men against women. And obviously, people say that all the time, and I understand that feedback, but I don't think that's true, because if I don't bring women in, then I get asked why are you leaving women out, and if you don't bring women in, you've got nothing to compare it to. Like you need a contrast, like just purely pragmatic. If I were to talk about Tory policy in government, that doesn't mean anything unless I bring up Labour policy. And I try not to make it a men versus women thing, but at the same time, it is important. It's important to say, like,
Really,
if I say there's only 50
yeah.
beds for abused men in the UK, that is shocking, but that doesn't really mean anything unless I say and 3,500 for women. That gives you a much better view of the problem and the double-sided nature, double standards. So it's like a minefield. Like every you always get something wrong, and that's fine. That's all part of the learning process on my behalf. But
Yeah, and that's part of it, isn't it? I think there's a huge difference between getting something wrong, holding your hands up, and
mm,
saying, "Okay, I got that wrong," to just dump it down and choosing not to change your opinion on anything. But no, that just communication online is so
mm,
difficult because you're so limited, and people's attention
mm,
span is so limited. You expect it to condense. Depending on what you're
mm,
sacrificing to the
mm.
algorithm
Um,
gods, whether it's
uh,
your dignity
People are
or,
just
or whatever it may
hypersensitive.
be, to
People are
capture
super
people's
sensitive, and I'm
attention.
hypersensitive to
Yeah,
certain
yeah.
things. Like the amount of times you hear, like in the news, just something white straight male trope, like white men need to do this, white men, and it's like white men, white men, white men. I'm so over that. Whenever I hear those words, white straight men, on the radio, my eyes like roll to the back of my head so far that I'm just like I'm over it. I
You
check
just
out. I'll
glaze
just change.
over.
I'm so bored about conversation being had in such bad faith. Not to mention not highlighting the fact that I am most privileged because I'm
Mm.
middle class. Nothing about my class, purely about the colour of my skin and my genitals. Like that means anything. And yeah, I think we're just very sensitive to these things, and not just me, everyone. And it's easy to misinterpret someone,
Mm.
especially online. Like one of the things I learned from my time running a business is that often you get into heated discussions with clients on email, and you're like, oh my god, this is going to shit. And then you call them up, and everything's great. You're laughing, yeah. Well, I feel so stupid. I can't believe we did that. Anyway, yeah, let's go for. And then like, there's something dehumanizing. What I'm trying to say, something
Mm.
very dehumanizing about digital conversation. Like this is pretty good, but this is still isn't as good as us sat having a coffee or something. And I just don't know if
Yeah,
social media is
absolutely.
really designed for these conversations. Really, like not only in the way it's dehumanizing, but it's limiting, and it's sort of it creates echo chambers where you're
Mm.
funneled into people that share your beliefs, and you're never really exposed to people outside, like me. And also, like because it's a lot of it's virtue signaling. I have a lot of people that love my account, want to share my content, but just don't dare because they know it's going to be seen badly. So majority, about 80% of my followers are actually afraid to share my content, including myself. And that also makes it. I'm being serious. I haven't shared a single piece of content on my own personal account. I don't even follow my own account. And I think that's a problem with social
Yeah.
media as well. It's about looking good rather than doing good.
Yeah, there's a lot said around the whole be your authentic self, but
Yeah,
no, not that part of
yeah.
you. Keep that bit to
Which is
yourself.
ironic because I learned that from my mum. Like my mum is the one, the voice of the timid is probably the voice of my mum, and she taught me like just as long as
Yeah.
you're understanding and you're taking everyone's point of view and there's no apology to be made, and you shouldn't just engage in this very tribal left versus right, black versus white, or like blue team versus yellow sports team style discourse. Like you need to
Yeah.
listen to people that disagree with you most of all.
Yeah. I've come to realization as well, like many people are just there really to assert their point and get some external
Yeah,
validation and a pat on the back for it. Because a lot of people that use social media, they say it's for good faith, and I'm happy to be corrected or happy to have my mind swayed on this. But sometimes you present a counterpoint, and very
they don't.
respectfully, and you're met with. And I'm still yet to see anyone just go. You see the comments in some
Mm.
people's sections. Obviously, larger accounts have an issue with it. I'm yet to see anyone in that conversation just go, "Do you know what? You're right. You've
But
totally
they
changed my
don't. They
mind." It
don't.
just
They'll
doesn't
never admit it.
happen.
I mean, people change their mind the day after whilst
No.
having a shower or something like that. Like they'll. It's not. It's not as simple as okay, my mind's now changed. Like you're changing it in very small corners of someone's mind
Yeah.
over a long period of time to the point where they may not even realize they've had their mind changed. Because it happens. It's like a very gradual, incremental process of small victories. But yeah, I get a lot of people that wanting. Like, I remember
Mm.
talking about how fathers don't have equal rights in the UK. Get DM'd by someone who just doesn't believe me. I'm like, well, they don't, and these are the specific ways. Still didn't believe me. I was like, well, then here is the legal document that says in black and white, literally black and white, exactly. And she still didn't believe me. And I'm like, what more do you need? Not to mention you've not presented anything to counterbalance what I'm saying. You're just clearly knee-jerk response. You
Yeah.
don't like what I'm saying, not because it's not true, but because you don't like it.
Well, that's obviously you with all your free time.
Yeah.
You've just
Oh, I
doctored
mean,
this
I mean, I.
legal this legal piece of paper that you've
Well, that's
told
why.
everyone that you've got from the
I
government
mean, I could
because
obviously do that,
that's
but
your
that's why they
agenda.
give them a
Yeah.
link so they can see it for themselves. But it's just like I am frustrated at how
Yeah.
belligerent some people are because what I'm saying is just unpopular, albeit true. Like domestic violence is one of the most controversial things I talk about, and I talk about how it's not a gendered issue and women are just as violent in relationships as men. And I have 1,700 studies now. The PASC, so the Partner Abuse State of Knowledge, the biggest database of domestic violence data in the world, 1,700 studies, and they basically completely validate what I'm saying, not a gendered issue. So hypothetically, I need the person to supersede that. They need to present 1,701 studies, and they can't. They can't even really give me one source to say that the overwhelming majority is towards women by men. And I'm like, you're just disingenuous and anti-intellectual to deny the evidence. And it's like it doesn't matter how big that mountain gets. It could be 17,000. They still won't believe it because they're ideologically wedded to a set of beliefs that they can't change.
And someone that is entirely biased,
No.
that you're not going to sway their mind anyway. It reminds me of, I'm sure you're familiar with it, the socialist Hall, his model
I
of
don't.
encoding and decoding,
No.
is that we obviously have, well, we have this encoding model, which is how we choose to convey our message and what our point in which we try to get across, or our agenda, whatever it may be. And everyone else
Mm,
has their decoding process through their biases. So it'd be ridiculous of me to expect everyone else to
mm,
understand things on my terms and how I interpret, because
mm,
they are looking through it through their eyes, which is why you see people just descend into comments, descend just into chaos because they have
mm,
their decoding process and they've managed to
mm.
extrapolate something you haven't even
Yeah.
said based on their experiences. And that's just,
Mm,
that I think that's just a coping thing for me. That helps me get my head around
mm.
people's responses sometimes. So it doesn't matter how I've presented it, they have their own decoding process, and that's how they've interpreted it.
And also the
Nothing I
idea in
can do
which
about
we
that.
form, maintain ideas is interesting as well. Like there are some philosophers that think an idea doesn't even exist inside your own brain. An idea exists in the community to which you belong. So to change your mind in the way you describe, you either need to change the entire mind of that community to which you belong, or disassociate yourself from that community entirely, and then you can change your mind. And I think that explains a lot of why people don't like what I say, because they're part of a community that is built around a set of fundamental ideas that are antithetical to what I say. And often those ideas are built into their very identity. Like a lot of the things I say are very counterintuitive to feminist ideas. And a lot of people are extremely proud of being a feminist, and it's part of their fundamental identity. It's part of their friendship groups and even their job. They might even have the T-shirt. And then I come along and I show them some information that is, perhaps slightly counterintuitive to that, and they can't believe it. Not because they don't want to, but they physically can't, because then they would stop it almost existing as who they are, because their political ideas are part of their identity. They're identifying as political ideas. It's a bit like trying to change your skin or change your sports team. Like, I will always be a Leicester City fan because that's where I was born, and it doesn't matter how well or poorly they do, although they have just won the championship title. So it was good. But when they got relegated from the Premier League, I still remained a fan. And when they were in League One, I was a fan. And I'll stick with them thick and thin, no matter who does what, how poor they become. That's how sports teams work. But politics are different. Politics, I left the Labour Party a few years ago because I didn't like the way they were going. And that's how politics works. So we shouldn't pretend like politics are like sports teams. Like, you can change your mind. You can call out your peers, and you can vote with your feet. You can leave.
Yeah. These are identities,
Yeah,
ideologies, and
yeah,
religions just
yeah.
all
Well,
feed into each
yeah,
other. You would just before I forget to mention it, because you were talking about the lengths that people go to increase their height. I stumbled across something last week. Penile
yeah.
fillers are the latest lengths men are going to. I didn't even know that was possible, but yeah, men are getting, same as men and women get Botox. Men are getting
Mm.
regular penile fillers to increase the girth
Yeah.
of their
So
penises now.
I mean, it's probably better described as like a sort of a bit like a spring roll type thing that goes around the penis under the skin, and it's basically the same technology as used in like Brazilian butt lifts, like an implant, and or breast implants. The same technology, and because it's based on that technology, it doesn't need to go through the same safety procedures. It's just passed through as another extension of that technology. It doesn't need to be examined in the same way. But it's not the same, because a penis is not the same as a boob or a bum in the fact that it changes shape and size all the time. So like a boob
It's
can have a
strange.
silicone implant with very little risk because it's not going to change shape apart from perhaps during pregnancy. But you can't have a penis because it doubles, triples in size, and it's like that's why these penile implants.
It's different
Yeah,
lengths at different times of the
and it's
day,
like
and
it's
it's
called I think it's called a pneuma, and it's already caused horrible, horrible like the stories you read of like just like the infections and having them
I didn't
removed.
Google
And
that.
I remember reading a
Images.
lot of the reasons
Yeah,
why men got them done, and a lot of them were like about what other people expected. They were like, oh, I just felt like I wasn't satisfying my wife, or I feel like women would prefer. It wasn't like, oh, I just wanted it because I feel more comfortable. I would still be very cautious on that, but it seemed like a lot of it was just men projecting what other people or what they thought other people wanted. And yeah, I think it's called a pneuma, but it's just a horrific device. And then you have everything. You have pills, you have pumps, you have fat injections, and it's like, I don't know. Like, there's evidence now that shows that body dysmorphia is even more prevalent in men than women now, in terms of men showing signs of insecurity in their body. And again, I think that's just a lack of visibility given to
yeah.
men, and in fact, the opposite by people like Billie Eilish, which is saying that men doesn't even exist. It's not even possible for man to feel insecure. I'm like, you,
Admittedly, and selfishly, I really wanted to delve into that with you today, but I'm hugely appreciative of your time and cautious that we
yeah,
are
it's been a pleasure.
ticking on a bit. But if I can shamefully ask you, whilst you're on,
Yeah,
can we possibly pick this up another time? Because body dysmorphia and this whole idea around being masculinity in some way becomes
bigorexia.
so skewed, and back to the point,
Yeah, yeah, mm,
bigorexia, back to the point, the objectification of men, Love Island, how
yeah,
our superheroes are
yeah,
portrayed. It's a
yeah.
huge fascination for me, and something
All
I've
right.
experienced to a certain degree myself. Because, but I am very cautious of your time. And just before you go today, because I think that's probably a good point to wrap up, could you talk a little bit about your petition
Well,
to appoint the Minister of
I
Men
can
and
start by
Boys
telling you
and
it was
why you think it's
unsuccessful.
important?
So it wasn't my petition. It was a petition that I supported and promoted, but it needed Yeah, it
Oh,
ended
is it come to its
ended a
end
few
then?
days ago, so
Sorry, apologies.
you're almost in date.
Oh,
Yeah, so you
just
need
missed the mark.
10,000 signatures to get a response, 100,000 to see it debated in Parliament. I think it got about 6,000, and it's basically demanding that the UK appoint a minister for men. So the way it works for women is there's a minister for women, there's a minister for women's health, and now a newly appointed ambassador for women's health. All three very worthy positions, governmental positions, which I support. But I also support at least one of those existing for men, like a minister for men, to talk about all the issues that I speak about. I'm very much aware that I'm not the best person to be speaking about this. I'm a Bachelor of Arts from a very middling university, and I would also prefer these conversations to be had by people frankly more qualified than I am, such as a politician, like a Minister for Men, who's backed up with the best evidence available, and that's why I'd rather him do it or she do it. So yeah, the petition was to appoint a Minister for Men to look at things like suicide, men's mental health, boys being behind education, which we've not spoken about, addiction, homelessness, especially like really important issues. Like almost 90% of homeless deaths are men,
Mm.
for example. Like 70% of drug addiction deaths are men. 78% of suicides are men. Boys behind every stage of education. Like these are all massive issues. Like men's health, awful, really poor. Living shorter lives in every country in the world, and male victims of abuse, for example, only 1 or 2% of abuse refuge is dedicated to men. Like really important things, and that petition's failed, so they're not interested. But we'll try again. So maybe next episode, I'll have better news.
Well,
Yeah,
I've got to hold you to it now,
yeah,
haven't I? Yeah, absolutely. No, I think there's so much there, and with these big social cultural shifts, it shows it's
mm.
far more multifaceted and
I
complex
really,
than
yeah,
people let on,
and
and
it's just
there's so much involved. But I've really enjoyed the conversation, and genuinely, I
thank you.
really appreciate the work that you're doing. I do, I hope that there's more out there. Just in case, well, I'm sure they will. Anyone wants to find out a little bit more about you, George? What's the best place to
The
find you?
main
Or
account is the Tin Men on Instagram, but there's also we also put content now on LinkedIn, Facebook, we have a Discord, a few others, Twitter, but Instagram is the way you should go. The Tin Men.
amazing. Thank you
Ah,
very
happy to be
much. I
here. Happy
really
to be here.
appreciate
Thanks
you
for having
and
me.
your time.